Hi, this is Jerry Beck with ASIFA-Hollywood. We're doing a Q&A today with Reid Mitenbuler, the author of Wild Minds, an amazing book that I highly recommend to everybody. It's not a history of animation per se. Reid, hello, Reid.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I want to know, and I really do. I want to know about this book and about how it came to be. That's the key thing. And what makes this different from histories of animation, other histories of animation that some of us have written. And why did you think this book was needed?
Right.
How's that for a bunch of questions?
Yeah, we'll have to revisit some of those questions so I remember all of them. But yeah, so there are a number of other really good histories of animation. But the thing about the one I just wrote is, the thought had occurred to me at one point. There are all these icons of classic animation. You have Felix the Cat, Betty Boop, Popeye. Jerry, you and I have talked about this before, where everyone knows who they are. They could pick them out of a lineup, but I'm not sure they've ever actually seen one of their cartoons. I mean, Felix the Cat now, I mean, that's a century old.
Yep.
Betty Boop is coming on 100 years old.
Yep.
And so, people have seen plenty of T-shirts with pictures of these people on them, and they see their pictures everywhere. They've seen a Felix the Cat clock on the wall, but have they actually seen their cartoons? And I realized that they were passing out of living memory, I think, for a lot of people. And when I had started looking into the world of old animators and the original cartoon studios, I was really drawn to the stories of the personalities behind them. Who made these cartoons, what inspired them, what were they trying to say? Because a lot of times what they were trying to say, I think, is a little different than what people today remember cartoons as. There's this idea now that they've always sort of been made for kids. It's always been kid stuff. And that was my working assumption for a long time. When I was a kid, I thought, oh, these are specifically made for me. Because when I was a little kid in the 1980s, cartoons were kind of directed at children a little more. I didn't realize that the classics that I was seeing had originally been made for adults, and that a lot of times the versions I was seeing were sanitized and filtered in a lot of ways. And so I was reading at one point, years ago, a book of the American concept of hip, of cool. Like, what do we think is cool? And the writer, John Leland, he goes through all the different decades of cool icons, like Henry David Thoreau, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, James Dean. And why do we think these people are cool? But he uses cartoon examples a lot. Felix the Cat, Betty Boop, Fleischer stuff. And I never thought of cartoons as being cool in that way, that adult way. And so I revisited them as an adult and found myself laughing at them far harder than I ever had as a kid, and seeing all the political satire and social satire and very sophisticated themes I hadn't previously associated with the art form. And asked those questions we just talked about, like, who were these people who made them? What were they trying to say? And realized that there was another story there, of these studios being started and the rivalries that a lot of these artists had with each other, and the friendships that they had with each other, and the different things they were saying with their art, and how the cartoons of this golden age era, which is about 1911 or so, through when cartoons stopped being made for theatrical release, so the 1960s, really reflects the America in which they were made. You can go down all these little alleyways and you learn a lot about this older, weirder America, the personalities, the time, the history, which is also really interesting. And so I wanted this book to be a narrative history, which is what separates it from a lot of those other histories, of treating the creators behind the cartoons as the personalities and going into their worlds and tracking along with their stories and telling it in that way, almost a little more like a novel or something, like what they were trying to do, what they were trying to achieve with their art. So
you bring up a really interesting point that I hadn't even thought about. The word cool, that the characters were cool in their day. When I think about Bugs Bunny, he's a cool character. Felix the Cat is a cool character. Even even when cartoons and theatricals died off, still aimed at the general audience, quote unquote, adult audience, the Pink Panther, quite a cool character if you think about it. I just find that's an interesting idea. Wow, I mean that's cool.
Yeah, and in that book I mentioned, the one that it helped. There are many influences behind my writing it, but the writer John Leland, in his book Hip: A History, he asked that question, well, what do we think is cool, and why do we think it's cool? And he gets at the point where there is always this rebelliousness at the center. It's pushing against the mainstream, pushing against the status quo. When you think of Jimi Hendrix lighting his guitar on fire, that's kind of a protest in a way. Or Bob Dylan plugging his guitar in at Newport. James Dean, there's that element. And when you think about the Fleischers, you've got this Jewish immigrant family, and in the 1930s, they're working a lot with Cab Calloway, a jazz musician. And in that era, jazz was as controversial as hip hop would be in the 1980s, here in the United States. And I realized there was an element of danger. There was a subversiveness in those old cartoons that I don't think we always associate with them today. And what they were doing was very edgy and probably made a lot of people uncomfortable. And they were doing that a lot of times too. There was a little commentary about their experiences in America and that kind of thing in those cartoons. And so that had really gotten me thinking, that concept of cool. Who do we think is cool? And the Fleischer characters, Betty Boop, certainly, Popeye, certainly, Felix the Cat, these were things that were sort of pushing against the mainstream and were a little rebellious and made a lot of people a little uneasy. So they're cool in that way.
Just to continue that line for a second, I'm thinking about it while you're talking, and thinking about each of the decades. You went over a lot of them right now. I'm suddenly thinking about the 50s, which of course is the height of conformity and normalcy that people think about. And the character of that decade, I don't think I'd call him cool, but I'm gonna make your point on that. That character would have been Mr. Magoo, but it wasn't Mr. Magoo himself that I think was cool. I think it was the UPA studio of the 1950s that was pushing against and was cool, and I think this is a great, wow. I mean, I see the pattern here, and it's, I think you're right. It actually goes way up till today, and the shows that we have, or, the Simpsons, Beavis and Butthead, and other things beyond that, wow, that's a great way. But let's go back to your book, and you mainly talk about, although you go a little bit into the 60s, I believe, you mainly are talking about like up to the war and way back to the beginning of animation and the war years. And of course, it seems that each chapter is built around several anecdotes, if not one big anecdote of some sort, that, that's just something that you go, wow. I mean, even I, who knew some of these things, I'm like, this is cool. This is cool. This is, we should have a little animated bird come down. And every time I say the secret word of cool, I'll win something. But let's just talk about a few of the major figures, which you do. For example, I'm looking at my little list here, Winsor McKay, right off the bat, really doing something revolutionary with quote unquote, the art form. There really was no art form. It was just kind of experimental and, cinema, really, testing what you could do with stopping the camera. And, McKay, subverted that towards for cartoon purposes and vaudeville purposes and show purposes.
People a couple of times have asked me, well, what makes this the golden age? What makes the golden age? Because we all remember, golden ages aren't always golden ages for everybody, right? What's a golden age for one group or person might not be a golden age for other people. And I think that what makes this a golden age is that in those early days of cinema, none of the language existed yet. Everyone is figuring out how to tell stories on screen, and they're inventing. All the techniques that today we take for granted when we watch movies and animation. But back then it was like, well, what will work? And so they're just throwing spaghetti against the wall, seeing what's going to stick. And it's from this period that you see all of, you see the language being created. You see it all being used for the first time. It's easy to take for granted today,
Right.
how they maybe came up with it. Those bolts of inspiration that came down from the skies and inspired them to come up with some of this. And with McKay, it's so interesting because he was a very, very successful newspaper cartoonist, right? And animation, and I describe him in the book as being the patron saint of animation, just because he inspired everybody, the Fleischer, everyone, when they saw Gertie to the Dinosaur, Walt Disney, Fleischer's, Chuck, to everyone, they say that this was huge for me. This is why I got into it. This is what made me want to do the same thing. And for him, it wasn't even his main job. It was just a side hobby. It's something that when he was working for the Hearst papers, William Randolph Hearst is trying to prevent him from doing it because it took him away from his real job, which is drawing political cartoons for Arthur Brisbane, who, was kind of the overheated cable pundit of his day, diatribes in the papers and that kind of stuff. And he would illustrate for him and do his own cartoons. But it took him away from what, was really help sell Hearst newspapers. Right. And so he's doing this kind of, as a real passion project. And, that's very cool. But what really drew me to McKay's story too is this idea he had in the very early days of animation when nothing was written yet. The page was still white. And he said, this could replace art. I've got the quotes in the books, but he's got all these quotes about someday maybe people will walk into museums and there won't be paintings on the wall. This will replace that. This will just be, when people go to museums, they'll see cartoons. And that was kind of the ideal he set. He had these very high standards. And of course, it took him a really long time to make anything. He's doing it all by hand, doing it all himself. But those ideals he had, were really hard to match. And a lot of people realized, well, it's not really sustainable as an industry. We need being able to put out cartoons much faster than you can put them out. We need to create a process, and they do have to appeal to a much wider audience than you're maybe talking about, Winsor McKay. Yeah. So then you see how the art starts kind of going at loggerheads a little bit with certain ideas of commerce and business. And then you get that age-old debate that you have in any kind of art form. And McKay was sort of there at the beginning of that and defining the borders for some of those discussions, I think.
Totally. It's interesting that animation went almost immediately from McKay being high-minded. Today, we would say that's an artist, an independent animator would be today's example of what McKay was. And then immediately there's an industry that pops up and immediately creates limited animation, actually, which I find, and it's commercial.
Lawsuits, lots of lawsuits.
Yeah, it's the stuff that when I came of age, we had Disney and we had Hanna-Barbera doing TV animation, and it was like art, and we had independent animators too, and that was kind of like what the field was. There was a big debate about what is it commercial or is it art, and that debate started literally in the teens 100 years ago, and it brought all these interesting characters into it. It would take decades. I teach and I talk about how it literally took decades for art artists, fine artists to try animation, and that's a whole other story. But it's what we think of as animation are these commercial films and characters. And as like you and I, we were raised on those things and we love them, and we want to know more about them. Let's talk about, I'm jumping around here, but on the Fleischers is such a fascinating, that's the thing. Every one of these people has got a fascinating story, and circumstances and situations that made them what they were. When people think of Fleischer, obviously there's the obvious iconic things that come to mind: Betty Boop, Popeye, maybe Gulliver's Travels, maybe The Bouncing Ball, that was mainly the 1930s. But Fleischer in the beginning, just getting into the business, just trying to get in with this rotoscope thing. Tell us about Fleischer and what your opinions on Mr. Fleischer and his what he was trying to do and whether it worked or not.
I think there are a couple things I find really fascinating about Max Fleischer. And the first thing is, in one person, you have this combination of all the elements that go into animation. So you've got an artist, he's a cartoonist, he's drawing for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, but he's also very mechanically minded. And he comes from a very mechanical family. His dad was a tailor, but his dad also was an inventor. He had invented this kind of button that police officers could use, so that they wouldn't get, boot polish or whatever on their shirts, so they could detach their button, like that kind of thing. And then they had, a lot of inventions came from the family, like the claw digger machine, you'd see it Coney Island, like that kind of thing. One of his brothers invented that. So he had this very mechanical mind, and he's working, doing a lot of scientific illustration. So you see this science part of his mind, and the engineering part of his mind, and then the other part of his mind. And then he also brings business into it. And so that's something that really drew me to him. But the other thing was, he was the number 2 to Walt Disney. So you talk about animation and old animation to people today, they all know, everyone obviously knows Walt Disney, like number 1, that's the name I remember. But the guy who's arguably number 2, Max Fleischer, certainly not a household name today anymore. And when he passed away, the circumstances were a little sad, and he hadn't had a studio for years and had kind of was disappearing into the mist, so to speak. And that really struck me, to be as good as he was and to have churned out as many iconic characters as he did, and to always have to live in the shadow of this other person who sometimes Fleischer's studio was able to surpass the work of Disney, and then sometimes he didn't. And there was one story in the book, that I really like. And Max Fleischer he tried to compete with Disney to be the first person to put out an animated feature. Of course, he wasn't. It was, Walt Disney beat him with Snow White. But when Snow White appeared in New York, which is Max Fleischer's turf, that's where he always lived.
Right.
It played at Radio City Music Hall. And the site where Radio City Music Hall sits, Radio City Music Hall had actually been built on the site of Max Fleischer's boyhood home. They'd lived in that part of Manhattan, and then they had moved to Brooklyn. And his boyhood home was raised so that they could put up Radio City Music Hall. Yeah. And so when Max Fleischer is walking under the marquee, he's staring down at the pavement. He couldn't even, here's the guy whose shadow he's got to live in, and here is the first feature. He's been beaten to it, and it's playing on the actual literal site of his boyhood home. I mean, it's just getting the salt rubbed into the wound constantly. There's a great figure. So when I'm telling these stories through the actual characters, I'm trying to tell them sort of that way.
Right.
And that rivalry between the two, which I think Fleischer saw as a big rivalry, and I'm not sure Disney saw, because he was the king. He was on top. So not as much of a rivalry for Walt Disney, who was very gracious to Max, certainly later when they finally met in the 50s.
Yes, that little thing, that 1950s reunion, that there's photos, and so that always actually brings a tear to my eye. I don't know if men are allowed to admit that, but that really is touching, that he hired his son, Max's son, to direct 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and then hosted him. Not only hosted him, they could have just had a private lunch. They could have met him in his office for 2 seconds, but no, they made a big deal about Max Fleischer visiting the studio, and any of his ex-animators who were employed at the time were invited to join them for lunch. I think makes me cry when I think about it. Anyway,
and there was a line from Richard Fleischer, Max's son. Yeah, and before Richard Fleischer took that job, directing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he did ask his dad, and he had said to Disney, "Well, you know who my dad is." Disney's like, "Of course. I've got to run it by him." And Max was very gracious. "Of course you should take the job. And then there's a line, and Richard Fleischer wrote a book about his father, and there's a line in it where looking at his dad sitting at that table, surrounded by all of his old employees, and then sitting there next to Walt Disney. And this is in the 50s when Walt is already an icon and he's building amusement parks. And Richard Fleischer just says, it's as if I had just witnessed Goliath defeating David. And he says about his own father. There's this little touch of melancholy there that you kind of missed up a little bit. You're like, it's really,
Yeah.
it's kind of sad.
Now Disney maybe all those wonderful things we all know of him and the studio and the theme parks and all the movies, all the wonderful things that he did. But he had his struggles too, you know, for a long time. In fact, probably around the time of that movie and that Fleischer reunion, I actually think that was where they're finally on some solid ground with Disney, where he's got the TV show, he's got the theme park, you know, things are really, they've got Buena Vista distribution. They've got the kind of the earliest seeds of the company, the giant conglomerate it is today, are probably right around that 1954-55 period. But it took till then. So this is something I talk to my students about. I go, you know, it's not like they had the cash cow of Disneyland to be able to make Lady and the Tramp. They had to go to a bank. They had to talk to their distributor. They had to. It wasn't like it later would be. But even way before that, I mean, your book goes back to Disney, the uber ancient history of Disney in the silent era, and you know, the whole Oswald circumstance and things like that. One of my favorite, by the way, I'm just going to jump around. One of my favorite things, there's a whole bunch of Disney stuff that he was trying to do. This is like the 40s. This is Fantasia, where he wanted to build Fantasia movie theaters, you know, things like that. And there's things that Disney failed at, even Fantasia itself, which I think is a masterpiece, but it's an artistic masterpiece, but it was a financial major flop for the studio, big time. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop talking and let you let's talk about Disney. And I want to hear about some of the Disney disappointments, I guess would be a way to put it.
One of my favorite stories about Disney, one thing that connects Max Fleischer and Disney a little bit, is that it took both of them a while to find success. They had those early failures. And with Disney, I think, you know, people don't always understand, he was in LA for a while before he really took off, making cartoons, you know, and Oswald, and struggling. And he was an artist first, a businessman second. He always took these pretty audacious gambles. And I love the story of how, you know, Disney, his relationship with his father could be strained at times. And I think, you know, he was looking to his father for some acceptance. And Elias Disney was a stoic Midwesterner. And when Walt Disney was building the Burbank studio, he's taking his father around and he's showing it to him and he's proud. And his father asks, you know, well, what else is it good for? And that's when Disney admits that part of the deal he got, in order to be able to even build the studio, his financiers, Bank of America, it had to double as a hospital. In case his studio failed, it could all be easily converted into a hospital. So all the offices could become wards, and the little alcoves in the studio where they had candy and soda machines would become nursing stations. And so they were hedging their bets. It was like, okay, this Disney guy, he's made some hits. He's done some pretty interesting stuff, some big deal stuff. We don't know if he can keep this up. So in case this whole thing fails, we can at least take this building and it won't be just a complete disaster. We can just turn it into a hospital.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is that literally after Fantasia, almost exactly after Fantasia wasn't working financially, World War II breaks out. And that's another story. They get taken over. The studio gets taken over by the government. Their finances, because of Fantasia's failure, are different. They're starting a program of B features like The Reluctant Dragon. And then Pearl Harbor hit. I mean, that's another period that I don't think Disney puts a nice gloss on it, you know, the success of this and that and whatever, Bambi's coming out and everything. and Dumbo, of course, emerges from that period. But that was a down period for Disney in the studio. They're kind of forced in a way to make the war films. I mean, not against their will, really, but it's not what they want to do. Disney's grand plans for making movies like Cinderella and Peter Pan and Lady and the Tramp, all those things were being developed already, in 1940, and all of that's off the table now. We got to do these good neighbor policy films. I know you write about what. Tell me about Disney during the World War II period. What?
Yeah, and not to mention some of those failures too were because the war had cut off lucrative overseas markets,
Right.
Especially the European market. So I always wonder how, especially Fantasia, would have done if the war just hadn't cut off that market. But in the 1940s, that's one of my personal favorite periods of history to look at for Disney, because all the studios are involved in propaganda films and they're doing training films for the military. So those are really interesting, just because they very much paint a picture that you don't expect from animation. Because those films sometimes were classified. It was so you could do anything because they weren't going out for public distribution, so they could make them as bawdy and as dirty as they needed, because they're supposed to attract. So you got these young soldiers, and they needed to teach them things about, well, be careful who you talk to, and honey traps. If you're venereal disease and all these things that you really needed to teach these young soldiers off fighting. They're making these cartoons to address those issues. So they and they realized a lot of the troops are falling asleep with the normal training films. So we really need to jazz it up for them. So they're doing that. And then you see, especially with Disney, he's approached to do these films, Saludos Amigos, and you've got the Germans are down in South America, and they're trying to win over a lot of governments that have stayed out of the conflict. And the United States realized, well, we need to counteract that. We need to put on a public relations effort. And so Disney sent down there, and he's touring all these countries, and he's making all of these films, that are going to be playing in Spanish, and they're selling the United States to the populaces down there. Like we're America, we're right here, we're your neighbor. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty popular down in South America. And it's funny because then when when Saludos Amigos was released in the United States, certain key parts were taken out. Like they didn't talk about, certain parts of the neighbor relationship, and things like that. Like there are certain parts that were selectively edited out for American audiences. But it's interesting to see Walt in that role, where he's an ambassador of sorts. So the United States is using him as this vision of America. You are America, go down, we're going to use you to counter the Nazi threat in a way. And it's a really interesting way to look at Walt Disney, I think, as truly being integrated into American politics and diplomacy, and not just, in art. But it's also interesting to me at that same period. So Disney in his heyday in the 30s and 40s, he had a lot of really interesting artists hanging around the studio. There was Salvador Dali, Thomas Hart Benton, Orson Welles had wanted to make The Little Prince with him. Walt's quote was something like, well, there can't be two geniuses in the same room. It was something along those lines. And when I think of Walt Disney in the 1930s and 40s, he was a really cool artist. And if you look at the way he was covered in the press, everyone adored him. I mean, he was everything to everybody. I mean, everyone just really liked him. And when you rise to that kind of height as an artist, inevitably in a few more decades, when tastes start to change, you're kind of set up for a fall. And then you've got, that vision of Walt that we see a little more nowadays, where sometimes he can be poo-pooed, or people use him as a symbol of corporate America, and that kind of thing, what came after. But in the 1930s and 40s, he wasn't that way at all. I mean, his stuff, it was always a major event when a Disney film came out, and he was covered that way by the press, and he was adored across the board.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, and I just think it's interesting because, the way he is sometimes criticized when you get to the 60s and you've got the counterculture, and then he all of a sudden becomes, That's when Disney starts to become more of an idea to people than a man.
Well, he passes away in 66, and I always thought that was kind of perfect, because I can't even imagine Disney and, hosting his show with a Nehru jacket and a psychedelic, banner behind him. But I think he belonged to that era, that 40s, 50s, early 60s era. And when the beginning of the what I can only call the hippie period, that basically starts right around there. It's still clean enough in the 1965 and 66. Rock and roll is still relatively clean. The Monkees, or the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and they had the Beach Boys were in the Monkey's Uncle, the Disney movie. It was all kind of clean cut. It got pretty. The next year, the year after he passes, is the Summer of Love. It gets more psychedelic. By the way, I just want to pontificate about that. It's I think a year or two later, they reissued Fantasia for the first time in 12 years or 15 years, and with a psychedelic ad campaign.
Mhm.
And it works. It becomes
Right.
an ed picture. And they did that with Alice in Wonderland a few years later, and it still worked. It was, hey, come see. They were appealing to stoners. Anyway, I'm going off on another subject.
And it was like, yeah, and they appropriated. It was interesting to see how the stoner culture appropriated him, kind of in a square to be hip kind of, sort of way. Like, oh, we'll take, because at that point in the 50s, I like tracing Walt's wardrobe throughout the book. When he's in his younger years, he actually was a very eccentric dresser. He wore all these really loud colors. There was this one jacket he always liked to wear around the studio. It was purple with these giant buttons, and he would mix and match argyles and plaids. I mean, I think I make a joke in the book. It's like a clown stumbled into a closet and got dressed in the dark, kind of. Maybe the clown was drunk, and it was very eccentric. But then in the 1950s, when he's hosting his show, that's more the Uncle Walt image. He's always wearing a suit and he's wearing a tie. Sometimes he would allow his ties to be a little colorful, like a little more, eccentric. It wasn't like what you'd wear if you were, going to go appear before Congress or something, but he was much more staid in the 50s. And that's the image that sticks with people today.
Right.
Of the Uncle Walt, where he's got his hair kind of Brill cream down and he's wearing a tie. That's the image that people have of him today. So I wanted to kind of resurrect that image of him in the 30s and 40s, where it was, and you see those old photos.
Yeah.
It's much more eccentric and
there's a famous trailer for Snow White. You've probably seen it, where he's introducing the seven dwarves, and I'm forgetting right now, but I believe he's wearing this beige. It's really cool shirt, actually, but it's completely not the corporate, Walt Disney that we all know later. But
yeah, totally far out. Totally
far out. That's a good way to put it.
The wardrobe that people with less eccentric careers weren't wearing. And Winsor McCay was the same way. He'd wear, suits that were beige and fawn and, just very.
Yeah. I think Walt Disney, like you, I feel like I've studied the subject a bit, and he sort of had Hollywood, he wanted to be part of Hollywood, but he carved out a section of it for himself that the rest of Hollywood was happy to let him have. He literally his name became synonymous with cartoons, Mickey Mouse, Disney cartoons. It was meant the same thing. There's a trailer for Victory Through Air Power, a film he produced with his own money, wasn't released by his regular distributor. They wouldn't touch it. It was his real contribution to the war effort. But in the trailer, there's a line by the narrator where he says, only the medium of Walt Disney could present, the graphic images you're seeing here. I love that. The medium of Walt Disney. It's like Hollywood has decided that's his medium. He can have it. He can do it. We'll give it to him. That's why there were no, outside of the Fleischer features in the early 40s, which was really the end of their studio, and then the war breaks out, there really were no other animated features in America for at least 15 years. Like I think 1959's UPA Mr. Magoo feature was the first American animated feature since Mr. Bug Goes to Town that wasn't Disney, and they literally handed the medium to him. in many ways, including Oscars. But that's, now we're getting into another subject. I want to ask you before we run out of time about you, where you come from. What you told me about what led you to this, but you've written books about bourbon and other things. So you're a man of many, many, interests. So you're visiting our world with your cartoon book. But tell us about your background and the writings and things that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, I've had I guess, a pretty varied background. I've been asked this question before. My last book was, before Wild Minds, was Bourbon Empire. It's a history of bourbon whiskey. People always ask, well, how are those two subjects connected? They get a little confused by that sometimes. And I always kind of like, I was joking while I was researching both. I was like, I had to taste through a lot of different whiskeys when I was doing the whiskey book, and you're watching a lot of old cartoons. I was like, I need to find a way to combine these two things. And so your work could just be going off into a room, drinking whiskey and watching cartoons and shutting the door and maybe telling people not to bother me because I'm working in here, right? But the thing that I think connects those two books is you have like two industries, the whiskey industry and the animation industry, which are very, very different, but they both represent America in a very unique way. I won't get too much into the whiskey stuff, but bourbon especially is this product. You've got the Whiskey Rebellion and you've got the Whiskey Ring Scandal, this political story. You really see how whiskey actually helped shape the United States, but also how the evolution of the United States helped create this iconic drink. And with the animation industry, especially the golden age of animation, you really see how America is reflected. You see this reflection of it culturally. There's an economic reflection. I like to get into the labor union stories with the cartoon studios, especially with Fleischer and Disney. And so you see that aspect. And then you've got this political story. I get into the House Un-American Activities Committee stuff and UPA. And so you can use animation as a lens to look at the country, that it's coming from. And that's what fascinates me about both those things. And so I see all this connection, that way. And so they actually kind of synthesize in a way. If you read both books, they do kind of synthesize. And it's that perspective that really interests me. These very quintessentially American stories. So
What do you think about the fact, going back to animation, that for the most part, and certainly from the beginning of animation to, I'd say actually the early 60s, animation has pretty much been a creator driven, an animator, an artist, even if it's commercial, even if it's a Disney product or a Fleischer Studio product. This mainly the studio and the artists there worked up whoever the characters were, the stories were. That was a freedom that I don't even think Hollywood in its golden age may have had. Everything was kind of calculated to, but the animators had a real freedom to do what they wanted. Now that changed, I think, in the 60s and late 60s and 70s after Walt Disney passed, when there was no leader anymore in animation, and the TV networks sort of took over what was commercial animation at that point, and it was kind of leaderless for a while. We've had a renaissance since, and things have changed, and maybe changed for the better and back and all that. But animation, it's in its raw form for literally at least 5 decades or 6 decades. It's pretty wild. Perfect to go with the title of your book. But it was a wild west, of creativity, actually. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the reason for that is that for so long, animation was kind of looked down upon.
Yeah.
Like all the big studio heads in the golden age of Hollywood, when you look at, the big heads like Louis Mayer, Goldwyn, the Warner Brothers, they all looked down on it a little bit. It was just kind of like a side thing. They didn't really care. If they didn't look down on it, they really didn't care about it. And so I think that
that famous story, that famous Chuck Jones, that he once met. People would always ask him, "Have you ever met the Warner Brothers?" And he said he met Jack Warner once, and his only thing that Jack Warner said to him was, "Oh, don't you do those Mickey Mouse cartoons for us?"
Right.
Which I think didn't exactly happen that way. It may not.
Yeah.
I'm sure they knew who Bugs Bunny was, but that you're right. That's tying into what you're saying, that the thinking, lumping them all together, go on.
It was like lumping it all together. It's all its own thing. It was just that allowed for a lot of creativity and freedom, because they didn't always necessarily have as much oversight, or they could just kind of do whatever they wanted. And there was that period in the 1920s where, cartoons almost went away. There were people kind of saw them as a novelty, maybe as a little gimmicky. This is in the silent era. And it was like, well, I don't really care for them that much. And then once sound hits the scene, all of a sudden the studios realized that they could use cartoons to generate ancillary incomes, because a lot of the studios had music catalogs that they own. They own the rights to pop songs. And then it became, we don't really necessarily care what you're putting in the cartoons, just as long as you can cram a couple songs in there, like the Fleischers with the Paramount music catalog. So they would just get those songs in there, and they could kind of do whatever they wanted, just as long as it had those soundtracks that would help sell those records, that kind of thing, which created it protected the space for them to do all this other stuff. So I think that it's a cool story to look back on and look at it that way. They had that freedom for that reason. And then especially with Warner Brothers, Chuck Jones talks about this a lot, that kind of antagonistic push-pull that they like to have with the execs. I think Leon Schlesinger probably deserves a little more credit for allowing them to do that and realizing. Chuck Jones especially likes to, call them uncreative and that kind of stuff. But
he vilifies the producers.
he goes after the execs a lot, maybe a little unfairly, but it was part of the ethos at Warner Brothers to be pushing back and to be rebels that way, which gets back to the cool thing we were talking about. They were all rebels. Like, you would have Selzer, one of the execs at Warner Brothers, who said they couldn't do Pepe Le Pew. Like, you can't do that. And Chuck Jones saying, well, now we're going to do it just because he said we couldn't. Like that mindset.
Right. I know every time I see a famous line of something about he walks into the room and they're laughing about something and he just says, never make a cartoon with a bullfight or something like that. Bullfights aren't funny, right. And they walk away and they was the furthest thing from their mind. And then they immediately said, let's make a cartoon with, Bugs Bunny and a bullfight, which they did. And that's a great cartoon. But I can't help but look whenever I encounter, when I show films to my students or just review cartoons over and over again, like I want to do. Occasionally I'll find the bullfight cartoon. I keep wondering which one did he see that set him off to go into the studio to say that, but there were many bullfight cartoons. But yes,
I have a question for you. So with your students,
yes,
when you bring up some of these really old characters, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, but then going back further to the Fleischer characters, Betty Boop, Popeye, and then Felix, how many of your students are familiar, like they've actually seen some of those cartoons? They kind of what we were getting back at before. I was like, I know everyone can identify them from a lineup, but I don't think they've actually seen instances. Do you find that they're familiar with them already?
Well, yeah, what you said before, they, especially in California, we have Felix Chevrolet downtown. So
right, yeah.
we Felix, Betty Boop, certainly Bugs Bunny, they're still merchandising. And so they're at worst, they're familiar with the characters through some form of merchandising. Betty Boop has become sort of I call her a Hollywood icon character, meaning just like if you go to Hollywood Boulevard, they'll have souvenirs of Judy Garland, James Dean, Elvis Presley, and Betty Boop. She's just one of those iconic things, even if you don't know what she's famous for. Do they know the cartoons? No. They don't know the cartoons at all. They don't know the history of them. They don't know the studio that made them. What I love is that the students that I teach are usually 9 times out of 10, and that would be the right amount, are animation students. No, I mean, some of them are learning other things, other disciplines, acting. I have acting students. I have I have costume making students. I have all sorts of different disciplines, but most of them are animation students. They're doing animation. They're in college to do that and study that. And I'm introducing them to that. This is the greatest thing for me. That's all I have to say, is that I'm showing them Fantasia. I am showing them some of this stuff. Yeah, they might have seen some of the Disney films when they were 5 years old on VHS, or maybe they have the opportunity now with Disney Plus. But a curator, which is what I think I am, a teacher, a curator, introducing them to these films, what was historic about them, what's interesting about them, what's even not interesting. I also don't shy away from showing it, depending on the subject that I'm teaching, a poor film. You know, if I'm talking about the 40s, I will show a Terry Toon. I will show, you know, cartoons from studios that these are not, and I'll say something like, this is not an important film. I want you, you know, I'm showing it to you because it's an example of, and I want you to compare it against Disney or Warner's. You know, I want you to see what the difference here. If you just show the great stuff, you're not getting the right vision of what it was like. You need to show it. You need to have it all. And that's what's great about your book, because it's see, I could tie it in. No, it's shows us really another side of the people who made these cartoons. And I mean, I enjoyed it. I wanted to say it's a great read, but you are a great read for doing this book. It really is a great read. Very entertaining is what I really love about it. And what I love about it, I want to make it clear, is that I think you're going to get a lot of readers for this book that wouldn't read a history of animation, that wouldn't go out and buy, you know, the Winsor McCay biography or some of the others that are out there. But this book is so entertaining that it makes you want to know more about animation history and about animation and see the films, which I think is even the most important thing that a book like this could do. You kind of want to watch the cartoons again and see what you're talking about here and who were those names that were at the beginning of the film. And I thank you for that and for coming into our world. And
thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. That's, I think, our time for today. And I really, really appreciate, let me hold it up one more time. Reid Mitenbuler, Wild Minds.
We can mimic.
Yeah.
We're wearing the same shirt, so we can hold the same book.
Yeah, that would be the good
same background.
Grab.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And they told us that when we were done, we're going to have to wave our hands and say goodbye. So I'm going to do that. Thank you. Really great book. Thank you.
Thank you.